August 26th, 1346. 9,000 English soldiers, most of them common farmers who'd never seen real war, stood on a muddy ridge watching 80,000 French warriors march toward them. By the time the sun set that evening, 1,500 French nobles would lie dead in the blood-soaked earth. The English? They lost 3 men. 3. Against 1,500 of Europe's finest knights. A kill ratio so impossible it would shatter 5 centuries of military tradition and birth the modern world in a single afternoon of slaughter. What you're about to witness isn't just a battle. It's the moment peasants with wooden bows proved that noble blood meant nothing against superior tactics, the day chivalry died screaming in the mud, and warfare changed forever. But to understand how the impossible became inevitable, we must first grasp what drove 2 kings to stake everything on this killing field. The war that would consume a century began with a woman's bloodline and wounded pride. When Charles IV of France died in 1328 without sons, Edward III of England claimed the crown through his mother Isabella, a French princess. The French nobility recoiled in horror at the prospect of an English king ruling France. They crowned Philip of Valois instead, a man Edward would forever call the usurper. Edward wasn't merely fighting for a crown. He was fighting for legitimacy itself, for recognition that his blood carried the right to rule. Every raid into French territory carried this message. The true king had come to claim what God had granted him. Philip, secure in French military dominance, dismissed these incursions as desperate theatrics from a weaker nation. The numbers told an obvious story. France commanded 17 million subjects against England's mere 5 million. French heavy cavalry had dominated European battlefields for 3 centuries, crushing all challengers at Courtrai, at Cassel, proving repeatedly that noble blood in heavy armor meant battlefield supremacy. But Edward brought something France had never encountered: innovation born from desperation. In the brutal Scottish wars, he'd learned hard lessons about terrain, discipline, and the devastating potential of massed archery. While French nobles trained for individual glory and single combat, Edward drilled his men for coordinated destruction. His chevauché strategy wasn't mere military terrorism. Every burned village, every stolen harvest struck at Philip's authority itself. How could he be king if he couldn't protect his people from English ravaging? By 1346, Edward's latest raid had carved through Normandy like a blade through flesh, leaving smoking ruins from Caen to the Seine. Among his commanders rode his son, Edward of Woodstock, just 16 years old, armored in black plate that would earn him history's most fearsome name. The boy who would become death itself, later known as the Black Prince, commanded the vanguard, learning war's brutal arithmetic from his father. Meanwhile, Philip assembled the largest army France had mustered in generations. Among his nobles rode King John of Bohemia, the Blind Lion, who despite his sightlessness insisted on joining what he believed would be France's greatest triumph. The English force that climbed the ridge at Crécy-en-Ponthieu looked nothing like an army capable of changing history. 4,000 men-at-arms, knights and mounted sergeants encased in 60 pounds of steel plate, formed the armored corps. But the true revolution stood behind them. 10,000 longbowmen, each carrying a weapon requiring 150 pounds of draw weight and a decade of training to master. These weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, craftsmen, laborers, who'd spent every Sunday since childhood practicing at village archery butts under royal decree. Completing the force were 3,000 Welsh light infantry, fierce fighters with long knives who excelled at the grim work of finishing fallen knights. Against this, Philip commanded the pride of European chivalry. 12,000 mounted men-at-arms formed his corps, professional warriors trained from childhood, encased in the finest armor money could buy. Supporting them marched 4,000 Genoese crossbowmen, Europe's most feared mercenary missile troops. Behind them pressed 50,000 militia and infantry, eager for plunder and glory. The commanders embodied their nation's military philosophies. Edward III had transformed from impetuous youth to tactical genius who understood combined arms warfare. He'd learned that victories came not from individual heroics, but from discipline, preparation, and exploiting enemy mistakes. Beside him, the Black Prince commanded the right wing at just 16 years old, already showing the tactical brilliance that would terrorize France for decades. Edward had given his son real command, not ceremonial leadership. This battle would be the prince's examination in blood. Philip faced different pressures. His nobles demanded immediate action, viewing any delay as cowardice. Count Charles of Alençon, the king's own brother, openly questioned waiting for rest or reconnaissance. The blind King John spoke for many when he declared he'd rather die gloriously than live with shame of avoiding battle. The tactical geography favored the English dramatically. The ridge at Crécy rose gently from the French approach, forcing any attack uphill through recently rain-soaked ground that would exhaust horses and men. The forest of Crécy protected the English right flank, while Waudecourt village secured their left. Throughout August 26th, as the French approached, English archers prepared their killing ground. They dug concealed pits across the slope, horse traps invisible until too late. They hammered sharpened stakes into the ground at angles designed to impale charging cavalry. Every archer checked and rechecked his bow, ensuring silk strings remained dry despite earlier rain. Each man carried a sheaf of 24 arrows, the cloth yard shafts that would write history in French blood. The French council of war that afternoon became a shouting match. Alençon demanded immediate attack. More cautious voices suggested waiting until morning, resting the army that had marched since dawn. The Genoese crossbowman's captain warned his men's bowstrings were wet from rain, and they'd left their pavis shields with the baggage train miles behind. Philip initially ordered camp made, but as more nobles arrived and saw the English position, cries for immediate assault overwhelmed prudence. Here's the detail that explains everything that followed. Philip's army wasn't a unified force, but a collection of proud nobles, each commanding their own retinues, each desperate for glory before rivals claimed it. No clear chain of command existed below the king. When Philip finally decided to wait, his orders never reached rear columns, still arriving, pushing forward through narrow approaches. At 4 in the afternoon, French scouts crested the final ridge and saw the English position. What they reported sent ripples of excitement through French ranks. The English were trapped, backs to the forest, nowhere to run. The flower of French chivalry had cornered their prey. By 4:30, chaos consumed the French approach. Rear columns, hearing of English proximity, pushed forward eagerly. The road compressed as 80,000 men tried to funnel through narrow approaches to Crécy. Knights who'd marched since dawn in heavy armor mixed with fresh arrivals. Orders became impossible as the noise of armor, horses, and shouting created an impenetrable wall of sound. Can you imagine the confidence these French nobles felt? They outnumbered the English 9-1. They were professional warriors facing farmers with bent sticks. At 5 o'clock, the Genoese crossbowmen found themselves pushed to the front. Their captain, Andrea Doria, pleaded with Count Alençon for time to retrieve their pavise shields, massive wooden barriers that protected them while reloading. Alençon's response dripped with aristocratic contempt. Are these merchants afraid of English farmers? The Genoese had no choice but advance without protection. An English archer named Thomas of Hookwood later described watching the chaos. They came like a mob to a hanging, all pushing and shoving, their banners tangled together. We knew then God had delivered them to us. Philip made one last attempt to restore order, sending messengers to halt the advance. But noble pride had replaced military sense. Count Alençon openly defied the king. Does His Majesty fear English dogs? The die was cast. The Genoese began their advance with practiced precision. These were professionals who'd broken armies across Europe. Their war cries echoed across the valley as they marched in good order. But 3 factors worked against them. The setting sun blazed directly in their eyes, their bowstrings were still damp from the earlier storm, and they had no shields. The Genoese stopped at maximum crossbow range, 200 yards, and fired. The bolts, weakened by wet strings, fell short. Not a single Englishman was touched. Then the sky turned black. 10,000 longbowmen, each capable of 12 aimed shots per minute, released as one. 100,000 arrows in 60 seconds, each traveling at 140 feet per second, each capable of punching through mail armor at 200 yards. The Genoese captain had perhaps 2 seconds to understand his mistake before the arrow storm struck. The professional crossbowmen, Europe's elite mercenaries simply ceased to exist as a fighting force. Those not killed outright by the first volley tried to flee, but they'd walked into a killing zone with no cover. An English archer would later describe the moment with brutal simplicity. We could see the whites of their eyes when we loosed. When the arrows landed, we couldn't see anything but bodies. What happened next defies belief. Count Alençon, watching his mercenaries flee, screamed the order that would echo through history. "Kill those cowards! Ride them down!"